So as you think about 1 Timothy, I really think Paul, with his personality, when he wrote these letters to Timothy, it was very, very personable. And it may have actually been the most emotional books that Paul wrote. When he penned these, he was penning it to a friend. Or the text actually says a true son, a son in the faith. So, I don't know. When you read Ephesians, there's a lot of passions there, and Galatians 2 and Philippians. He's writing to those congregations. I feel he's a very passionate man. I just feel that 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy may be on a level that's so personal that we can relate to. It'd be relating to a family member, basically. So as we think about what we're going to study in 1 Timothy, I like to, when I teach the high school class or the middle school class, I like to ask them, who wrote Genesis? Or who wrote Matthew? Or who wrote Job? Or who wrote whatever? Who wrote Hebrews? And they always give me the correct answer. God wrote the whole book. That's all I have, but I can make some more. No, I'll make some for next week. Can we share maybe a copy till we get some next week? If you can share, that'd be great. We can get more made for sure. Thank you. I got one copy here. Has everybody got access to one? Everybody got access to a copy? Okay. Everybody's good. All right. Okay. Yeah, we'll get more of these made for sure. And that way everybody can have your own copy. So who wrote 1 Timothy? God did, right? So the question is, who penned it? Paul. Paul wrote it to his true son in the faith. So, not to, nitpick that or whatever, because the kids will say, well, you don't know who wrote Hebrews. And I say, I absolutely do know who wrote Hebrews. God did. But I don't know who put it on the paper, right? So, when Paul was writing to Timothy, he says in verse 2 of chapter 1, it's the true son, a true son in faith. Timothy's character is shown to us here. Timothy is a man after God's own heart. And Timothy is a person that was truly converted. When we believed and when we continue to believe and we repent and we confess and we converted to what God was teaching us, right? And we were baptized, we have that in common with Timothy. Timothy was born of a Greek father who had a Jewish mother, and his mother and grandmother was very influential in his Christian life. So much so they're mentioned, right? They're talked about. He was I believe that when Paul was on his first missionary journey in Leicester, he converted Timothy on his first trip. And then his second trip, when he returned back, he asked Timothy and Silas to join him in this mission work. What kind of testimony is that for was he a young Christian at that point? How many years between the first missionary journey of Paul and the second one? Do y'all remember? I don't either. 10 years or less, probably. God said he didn't know the number of years exactly, but in 1 Timothy, he was dealing with all sorts of problems. He did. He had trials all the time. So if you think about Timothy being a Christian and he's going through these trials, and then Paul says, hey, come and go with me. You need to stay strong in the faith. And that's a tremendous love on Paul's part, but it's also a tremendous attitude on Timothy's part, right? To say, okay, I'll do that. I want to serve the Lord to the best of my ability. So, and then when he joins him, I think the book was written somewhere around 63 to 65 A.D. Of course, I don't know how they figure the dates. It's an educated guess, but that seems right. So it was after Christ and after Christ's death. So what was the purpose, you think, of writing especially these two books? What do you think the purpose Paul wrote these letters? One was leadership. Two is the same thing. He needed to establish elders or bishops, and we'll get to that in chapter 3. What's another purpose, do you think? Ma'am? Yes, ma'am. Not to teach false doctrine, to stay true in the faith, right? So the purpose is all this combined. It was to instruct Timothy how to lead and organize the church, uphold sound doctrine, and live an example of godliness. We could most definitely apply those scriptures today, right? Is that the overview, Frank? He didn't hear me. I think Frank is passing out the overview questions for today's lesson. Is that what you got, Frank? Yes. Thank you. Perfect. Thanks, gentlemen. I appreciate it. So you'll have these notes. You can put them in your notebook as we proceed through. Yes, sir. Clyde talks about 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 4, gives us a starting point of how to introduce these two great letters. Nor give heed to fables or endless genealogies, which causes disputes rather than godly edification, which is in what? Faith. Which is in faith. That's a great place to start studying 1 Timothy, because it shows the purpose that we've already talked about, right? It shows why he wrote this letter. Why do we write letters today? Let me rephrase. Why do we text people today? Or why do we message people today? Yeah. Frank said we don't write letters today, but Clyde said it right. We may not have a physical letter, but it's for information, right? Coy reads the newspaper every single day for information, right? That's a good thing. Yes. That's true. And I relate that what you just said, what Paul did for Timothy. Carol said that if we do get a letter today, a handwritten letter, it's probably very important. And at the same time, it's very possible that we would treasure that and we would keep it as an important document. And Paul, she said, wrote this letter to Timothy out of love. And I concur with that. I think that's a good summary of what we're doing. Yes, Dennis? That's right. That's exactly right. Dennis said that a letter is an instrument that is portraying thoughts, concerns, love to an individual or to a group of people. And that's exactly what God did through Paul to Timothy. And when it's in print for us, that's how we can learn it as well, right? So, any other comments? So as we think about this purpose, and because of these letters were so personable and maybe most emotional, I think it's important that we consider the overall lesson of both of these books, especially 1 Timothy. The overall lesson would be order, sound doctrine, and godliness in the church, or even godliness in our congregation, right? To be sound, to hold true to the faith, and if we can do things like Paul and Timothy did, I think we're going to be okay, right? Because they imitated Christ. They imitated what was true. They imitated what God has instructed us to do. So if we can kind of keep that in mind as we study these books, I think it'll go a long way to understanding why Paul wrote it, why Timothy received it, and why we need to learn from it. So, Paul gives Timothy a manual, if you will, for getting the church in Ephesus to focus on teaching, maintaining order, and living faithfully. Could we say that Paul wrote it to Timothy to us today? Absolutely. Absolutely. We can do this on teaching the truth, maintaining order, and living faithfully. You know, the decisions have already been made about our worship. God's made those decisions. We just got to listen to them. God's already made all the decisions about our life. All the instructions are there. We just got to listen to it and apply our lives to what He's already told us, right? You think Paul was teaching Timothy to make decisions, or was he making decisions based on the truth? I think he was making those decisions based on the truth, right? We've already established the order of the purpose of this. I think the key verse of the whole book of 1 Timothy especially is in chapter 3, verse 15. But if I am delayed, I write so that you may know how you ought to conduct yourselves in the house of God. Not this building, not the building in the 423 North Main Street that we're currently in. It's not talking about that. What's it talking about? The house of God. Yes, Donald. Yes, sir. Donald said it's our day-to-day how to behave. What is conduct? What is conduct? When I was a kid, my grandmother said, behave. What'd that mean? You better behave, young man. What does that mean? Straighten up. Fly right. We understand what conduct is, right? Sometimes in a sports environment, young men or young women get penalized for misconduct, unsportsmanlike conduct, right? What does that mean? They were doing something bad. They were doing it out of order, right? So if you think about the conduct in the house of God, Don summarized it pretty good. Donald said, it's our day-to-day. It's not. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. It has to deal with our heart. That's what's going to guide God's going to guide it, but our heart has to be in it, right? So the conduct in the house of God, which is the church of the living God. Yes, sir. He did. That was a vicious hit, too. And I told Heather, we were at the game. Lewis said that yesterday was a good example of misconduct or unsportsmanlike. When that targeting call for Tennessee and he hit that boy from Arkansas, he hit him full go with his head, and the guy from Arkansas didn't have a chance. He about took his head off. I felt bad for the guy from Arkansas, but it was out of order, right? And so, which is the church of the living God? And notice the next sentence, or the next phrase. The pillar and ground of what? Truth, right? So, what is a pillar? Support column. It supports. So can we look at Paul and Timothy as support columns? Could we look at them as a pillar? Sure we could. Can we look at us today as that same pillar? That's the heart of it. That's what we have to learn, right? We have to think about, am I on solid foundation? Is my structural support column good enough and strong enough to hold the weight of sin? No. The answer is obviously no. I don't know who said that, but it's no. But God's is, right? So if we adjoin ourselves to God's support column, are we not following what Timothy taught? So I think that's the key verse of what we're going to try to do. I think Doug's probably having trouble with those overviews. So I'm going to text him and tell him not to worry about it, and I'll give it to you next week. Does that sound okay? I think he's probably struggling because they should have been done. They were not? Yeah. So, what are some of the major themes? Have you thought about 1 Timothy as what the themes are? We've already talked about one. The first one is sound doctrine. Hold firmly to the truth of the gospel, right? That has to be one of the constant themes throughout, actually both of these books, 1 and 2 Timothy. The second is godly leadership. Donald touched on it already. Each local congregation is commanded in 1 Timothy to have, we call them elders or bishops or shepherds, right? So character, it teaches us character is more important than the position, the character of the man. It goes through a lot of those, and we'll get to that, and we'll study those. And then the third general theme is prayer and worship. How's our prayer life on the daily? How's our worship when we come in? Are we an active participant in worship, or do we want to be entertained? Timothy's saying, Paul is teaching, that's not it. We have to be active for God, right? And then a faithful ministry. And I know you're thinking, I'm not a minister. You're not publicly, right? You don't stand in the podium and preach. But you can be a minister. How can you be a minister? Clyde said, because we're a member of the church. We can be a minister just simply because we're the member, right? Yes. Carol said that a minister is not necessarily, at its base definition, at its base root, is to help someone. And it's not to stand in the pulpit and to preach, and it's not to publicly pronounce, but it's to help someone. And the main cause of that, she said, is sin. So if we can help someone get out of sin or move from sin or continue to try to avoid sin, we're ministering, right? I think there's a difference between a minister and an evangelist. Do you agree or disagree? Everybody agree? Alan is a great minister, but he's also a great evangelist. How can I separate those? You're already ahead of me. You know that because Alan gets up and he preaches behind the pulpit on a weekly basis. That makes him the evangelist, right? The evangelist part would be a public person preaching the gospel. Paul and Timothy both did that. But they were both ministers as well because they were trying to get people out of sin. I think we have to keep that in mind when we relate it to what we can do today. We can be ministers. Thank you, sir. Perfect. Gotcha. Thank y'all. Thanks, gentlemen. Thanks, Doug. I can. It's on the first page of that overview if you read it. Yeah, I can do that. So did everybody get a copy of today's overview? Okay, I'll make sure we get it to you. Sorry about that. We just had some problems. Anyway, thanks, guys, for trying. Basically, Doug, we've decided the overall view of 1 Timothy is doctrine, sound teaching, leadership, and order. If we could summarize what we've talked about in the last 25 minutes, that's it. And the key verse, 1 Timothy 1, chapter 3, verse 15. That's where we are right now. And we're talking about the conduct, the house of order, and what is a minister. How can we be a minister in the kingdom? So we can be a minister at the grocery store. We can be a minister in our employment. We can be a minister at school. We can be a minister at a football game, right? We can be ministers everywhere we go. Is that what he's teaching us? Is that what he's teaching us? Yes, it is. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Clyde said that it's, at the end, he said it's very simple. We either know what we do or we don't. It's either or. But he said everybody's watching us. Our actions tell on us. He said that when we do something that's not right, people know. When we do something right, people know. And I've thought about that a lot. When I read this verse, most of you know years ago, I refereed high school basketball. And when I was refereeing high school basketball, I took Blake and Maddie with me. They were, young. And I'd tell them to sit at the scores table because every time I reported a foul or a violation, I could see them. So they were with me the whole time. So I worked basketball for several years, and I was in a gym watching Maddie play, and a guy walks up to me, and he goes, "I know you." I said, "Okay, I don't know you. Where do we cross paths or whatever?" And he goes, "I know where it was." He goes, "You used to bring your kids to basketball games, didn't you?" And I said, "Yes, sir." "How'd you know that?" He said, "Because I was in the gyms watching you work." I had no idea about that. I had no idea that he was even on the planet until that's what Clyde just said. And I'm not trying to say that to brag. Please don't understand that. He just saw me, and I thought, man, I need to make sure I do the right thing all the time. Second situation about that, I was working a postseason tournament, and we were traveling to East Tennessee, and I worked with a gentleman in our association, but I'd never known him. I didn't know who he was. Never worked with him before, and I met him in Rockwood. So we were going to Bristol, and we was doing work at semifinals of the tournament, and I got to about midway from Rockwood, and he looks at me and he goes, "So what congregation do you attend?" That was his exact words. I said, "Crossville Church of Christ, what do you?" And he said, "Rockwood." I said, "How did you know I was a member of the church?" And he said, "The same reason that you knew I was." Our actions were different. His actions was, I had a lot of respect for him. He didn't know my name. Brothers and sisters, he did not know my name, and he asked me what congregation I went to. Is that the application of 315 conduct? Absolutely, it is. So I think that's where we need to put our stake. That's where we need to start our study on 1 Timothy, is that foundation that Paul, through his pen and God's guidance, gave us to learn today. Any comments or questions? Yes, sir. Donald thinks, and rightly so, states that the ministry is a lot more than just the preaching, because the Bible teaches that those that minister, or those that teach, wait on their teaching, and those that minister, it's the minister. He said it's very important, both sides of it. It's all very important to the work. We can actually be members of the congregation. We can be members of the church and be ministers. Everybody's a minister, right, Donald? But not everybody can be a preacher. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. 90%, Frank said, of the people that see us don't see us in this building. So our mission field is outside the doors. That's a really good point. That's a really good point. And I believe that's the purpose of why we have 1 Timothy, the whole book, especially chapter 3 and then 15. Yes, sir, Mr. Curley. Yes, sir. Sure. Okay, I can see that. He said that the evangelist would be preaching to different people all the time. He travels around. A preacher would be a local person that would preach to the same people week by week. That's a really good point. I agree with that. So there's ministers, evangelists, and preachers. Where do we fit, right? So any other comments on this concept as we talk about the key verse and the conduct? I think that's very important to what we're going to try to do in the book. And it's important, I think, that we don't lose sight of it's in the church of the living God, and it's a foundational truth. It's the pillar and the ground. So, in chapter 1, Paul urges Timothy to remain in Ephesus to teach sound doctrine and stop false teachers. Verses 3 through 7. The purpose of this commandment is to love from a pure heart, a good conscience, and a sincere faith. Verse 5. So if we're in a sincere relationship with God, all this other is going to fall in place, correct? So if we are thinking about chapter 1 and what we would think the purpose of it is, I would say pure love, genuine, concern for those lost and dying souls. Yes, sir, Brian? Yes, sir. That love is everlasting. So as you read verses 3 through 7, Paul is teaching Timothy to be loving, to be good conscience. How do you have a good conscience? It's guided, absolutely. You can guide it to do the right thing, right? You can sleep at night, right? There's some commercials on TV now that irritate me. They talk about the mattresses or whatever, and people are doing things that are not exactly right. And they say, well, how do you sleep at night? Well, I've got whatever that brand of mattress is. I'm like, how sad is that? But really, can you sleep at night? Not because of the mattress, but because of your good conscience, right? Because you're in the faith and you're doing what's right. And what we try to do on a daily basis is what is taught in verses 3 through 7 here. So then Paul shares his testimony and receiving mercy, as he calls it, the chief of sinners, verses 12 through 16. Paul's history before he was a Christian was sincerely wrong, and he knew that. And he called himself the chief of sinners. God called him on the road. That's right, yeah. Can you imagine how much passion that Paul had after he was converted, knowing that he persecuted Christians? Have you thought about that transition? You can. That's right. Sure. Carol said that you can see it in his writings. You know, hold to the plow, just keep going forward, look forward, don't look back. You know, and at the end, in 2 Timothy, we'll talk about it. You know, he says, I fought a good fight. I finished the race. How do you finish a race if you're looking from whence you came? You don't, right? You just keep going. So that's verses 12 through 16. And then verse 18 in chapter 1 talks about the charge, if you will, or the commandment even maybe, that we fight the good warfare. That we're in it and we're going to fight it. This charge I commit to you, son Timothy, according to the prophecies previously made concerning you, that by them you may wage the good warfare. What's a good warfare? What's a good warfare? Yes, sir. Doug said it's a battle that needs to be fought. What's the battle that needs to be fought? Sin, right? Sin. And that's what Timothy was doing. That's what Paul did. And I firmly believe that that's what he's teaching us to do. Y'all have to forgive me for my basketball analogies, but that's That's what I did growing up, and that's what I did after school. That's what I know as far as that. But I played for a guy early on. He told us, he said, get in the fight and stay in the fight. And he wasn't talking about a physical fist fight. He was talking about the season, the game, the practice. He said, you get in it, you stay in it. That's a good word, Doug. Thank you. The effort. I think that's what 18 is teaching, is it not? Is the effort for us to be in that good warfare. The battle that needs to be fought. So if we think about chapter 1, the lesson would be stay true to the gospel and remember what God's calling is for us. And as for emphasis, get in the fight and stay in it, right? Any other questions or comments? So as you think about chapter 2, it's going to teach us prayer and proper conduct. Paul instructs that prayers, intercessions, and thanksgivings be made to all the people and the leaders, verses 1 and 2. God desires all men to be saved, verse 4. And then Christ is the one mediator between God and man, verse 5. And I don't want to pick and choose verses. I don't mean to do that. It's contextual in chapter 2, but verse 5 is very important that we understand that Jesus is the mediator, and He's the only mediator. He's the only way we can get to God. He's the only way that we can have salvation, right? So Paul, through his pen and his relationship with Timothy, told him straight out, Jesus is the only way. I can't say it any better than God. And that's what he teaches in verse 5 of chapter 2. Men are to pray without wrath. Women are to dress modestly and live with godly character. Men and women to live with godly character, verses 8 through 15. So chapter 2 teaches us that the church should reflect peace, prayerfulness, and godliness in worship. Peace, godliness in worship. Can we do that? Can we do that with a prayerful heart? That's what chapter 2 is teaching. Yes, sir, Brian. That was the end of the chapter. The verses 12 through 15, Brian. So any questions on chapter 2? So chapter 3 gets us into a situation that we talked about earlier. It's teaching that every local congregation needs bishops and deacons. It's teaching the eldership. It's teaching the overall leadership. It's teaching the structure of the church. And quite frankly, it makes me sad when I hear of congregations that don't have elders and deacons, but they have a men's meeting. Friends, that bothers me because it's not what God is teaching. I understand congregations sometimes are young, sometimes they don't have men qualified, but they should be teaching and growing and learning to that goal, right? As an eldership, we make decisions based on the Bible. The decisions are already made. But we have a policy that we do not support any work or any individual or any effort that is not under the oversight of elders. We feel that's important because chapter 3 is teaching that. Right, Frank? Right, Kyle? I didn't misspeak. Yeah, that's what we've. So it's important that we play by the rules. So if a congregation don't have elders, how can they justify the men's meeting? I'm just asking. I'm not trying to throw darts. I'm not trying to accuse. I understand some situations, but at some point you've got to grow to what God wants us to be, right? So, yes, sir, Donald. Sure. But Donald said that there had to be a period of time that they wasn't elders, that they had to grow, and Paul was taught Timothy to go and establish those elderships. I concur 100% with that. My question is, if a congregation's been in existence for 50 years and they've never had and still don't have elders, what time frame are they in? And what does that congregation do? They've had to have a solution. Okay, we didn't get through 1 Timothy in our overview, so I'll get you those overview outlines for Wednesday night. You can put them in your notebook. And if you will, study chapter 1, and we'll talk about it next week. Thank you for your time and comments.